Hey, welcome to another episode of the If You Mark in Your Bible podcast. My name is Josh, and today we are looking at Isaiah chapter 44, verses 6 through 8, and we are answering the question, who is like me? Participating in it, this study with us today is Keden Shrum. Keden is the preacher at the Rising Church of Christ in Rising, Arkansas. He's also been on the podcast before, so I'd encourage you to check out the notes below for the link to his previous episode. Keden, you doing all right? And thank you for coming on.
I'm doing great. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing well. Again, thank you. Appreciate the time that you put in and the time that you designated this morning to record this. As we mentioned, we're in Isaiah chapter 44. God is in this particular section of scripture, he's talked about destruction that's going to come on the nation of Israel and on the Hebrew people. And what's interesting is we kind of go throughout the prophets, and God will establish his sovereignty in order to either promise destruction or ensure deliverance. And so where we're at here in chapter 44, particularly this section, is he's trying to encourage and assure the people through Isaiah, the people of Israel, that they are still his chosen people and that he will deliver them. And now he's given them essentially his credentials, for lack of a better term. Who's like me? Can anyone stop me? And we obviously know the answer is no. And so that's where we're at. And so we'll pick up reading in verse 6. It says, "Thus saith the Lord, the King of Israel, and his Redeemer, the Lord of hosts, I am the first, and I am the last. Besides me, there is no God." What do you have there, Keaton?
Well, I mean, there's a lot that comes out just in this first verse. The first thing I note is Yahweh, right? I mean, when we get to thinking about the Lord and the covenant name of God, this should immediately draw their minds back to the very beginning of the covenant. They should be reminded of the promises they made there that their fathers had made and their ancestors had made to God, and why all this judgment's coming upon them because of what they had done. But with that, it should also remind them of the fact that Yahweh has always been faithful. So any problem that they have had, anytime that there has been, something change along the way, it's not because of him. It's because of something that the people have done.
Excellent point. I'm glad you brought up that word Jehovah. Anytime you see, and this is the English Standard Version, I believe the King James, New King James, and the line of American standards and so forth, if they don't use the word Jehovah explicitly, like I believe the New American Standard does, or Yahweh, like the New Legacy Standard Bible, what they'll do is they'll capitalize the word Lord in either all caps or a larger L with all caps, the ORD afterwards, signifying it's that Yahweh, the Hebrew word Yahweh, what we translate as Jehovah. And I'm glad you brought up the covenantal name. And that's a nuance that I think when we kind of read through this, especially when the prophets or even God himself is using this term, that's what's supposed to come to mind. And like you said, is that covenant. And I think you're absolutely right. Great, excellent point. He's reminding them of the covenant. A, you're in this position because you broke it. But B, I'm going to deliver you. And that's the other things we kind of go throughout the prophecies, is that when he brings up the covenantal name, especially Malachi, just it comes to mind. He's reminding them the only reason you haven't been utterly destroyed is because I made a covenant with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, David, and you go through the seed line from that standpoint. So excellent point. I also put the king, underline the king of Israel. Just put the theocratic ruler was a representative or an imposter, depending on how they ruled. So you look at the kings throughout Israel's history, a guy like Saul, and then you look at the wicked kings of the northern kingdom or the wicked kings of the southern kingdom. I'd call those imposters. The true king, you go to Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 1, which was last week's episode. The year that King Uzziah died, Isaiah looks up and sees the true king sitting on his throne. And I think God's making that point here. Don't worry about the king that's in place now. I'm still the king. I'm still in control. Most High rules in the kingdom in Daniel chapter 4. What else you have?
Well, when we think about the king aspect, let's go back to Saul, right? Why did they end up with Saul? Because they had rejected the king. And that's really what God tells Samuel is they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. They say, give us a king like everybody around them. They already had a king and they refused to recognize him. And that's the one that they, again, had made their covenant with. And so by the time you get to this point, over and over and over, all of their problems have come by rejecting the true king. And he's just reminding them again that, hey, you're my people, therefore I am your king.
Yeah, that's 1 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 7. 1 Samuel 8, give us a king that we might be like the nations around about you. And then, like you say, excellent point, because a great case study of God's anointed versus man's anointed is Saul and David. David eventually, you can point to essentially Christ as the ultimate one who's anointed. And I've underlined his Redeemer. And I don't know who, his Redeemer, we're talking about Christ. I think we're talking about two separate members of the Godhead in this one. Jehovah, representative of the Father here, Redeemer in the second portion, or B part of this verse, talking about Christ, which I just want to point out it's a nod to the deity of Jesus, even though there are some today who would try and deny that. Even in the Old Testament, we still see the second member of the Godhead, who we know is Jesus, being represented. Lord of Hosts, I underlined that also, and I put commander of the angelic army. Typically, when you see that, there is that the angels submit to him as well. You go for 2 Peter 2:11. The angels are greater in power and might, and I think part of the reason of using that is to remind humanity that even the angels submit to God. He's still in control of these beings that are greater than they are. What else you have?
Well, a couple things. First, with his Redeemer, when you think about, God was their Redeemer for this people, for the nation of Israel. He was their Redeemer, and even if you went back to chapter 43 and looked a little bit into that, dealing with that, anytime that you see the idea of a Redeemer, something has been paid, a price has been paid. Well, in chapter 43, he's talking about Egypt and the other lands which were given in order to redeem these people, and so anytime that they're now fast forward to the New Testament, of course, Christ was the ultimate redeemer. But again, something had to be paid for
Mhm.
us, of course, that being the blood of Jesus. Now, the Lord of hosts, that's actually what we would consider a name of God, right? This is Yahweh again, which when you think of Yahweh as coming from the Exodus, we're incorporating the entire Godhead into this because you see the angel of the Lord, which I would assume to be Jesus as the one that actually is speaking. Plus, you have the Father there, and so all of them encompassed together have made this original promise to these people, and ultimately the purpose was to lead to a point that Jesus could come, but as the Lord of hosts, again, you have this covenant name of God, and He is not only in control of this world, He's in control of everything. He is the Lord of hosts. Everyone, or Jehovah or Yahweh, however you want to explain it, they are all going to answer to Him. He's in ultimate control. Now, if I'm going to put my hope and trust in anyone, I want to put it in the greatest. So, really, the idea that we're seeing here is the King of Kings and now the Lord of Lords because he's in control of all.
Great point. You can underline Redeemer. It's used 3 other times in this book: 41, Isaiah 41 and verse 14, Isaiah 43 and verse 1, and then again in Isaiah 43 and verse 14, as well as here in verse 44. I've also underlined his, and I put Israel there. And I think
Yeah.
God's reminding him of that I am your Redeemer. I don't know how anyone would apply this to the Godhead, because there's no sense in the Godhead being redeemed. The only explanation I think maybe that could justify that is from the standpoint of John 3:16. God sent Christ to redeem. So the representative, the one who's going to redeem, but obviously not the one that would need to redeem God. And then you have, I am the first and the last. Jesus makes this statement 4 times in the book of Revelation. Revelation 1, verse 17, 2:8, 21 and verse 6, and 22 and verse 13, if I'm not mistaken. And this is a twofold statement when he makes it. One, shows the eternality, the existing one, I am, in Exodus chapter 3, John chapter 8, at the end of chapter, where Abraham was, I am the one who existed, no beginning, no end. It's also one who is showing a complete independence from creation. You and I exist, angels exist because God created them. This is a statement that says, not only have I always existed, but I am self-existing. My existence doesn't rely upon anyone else. And which, again, when you start to, like you mentioned, if you're looking for deliverance, what credentials beat this? And we're going to see in the subsequent verses 3 questions are going to be asked. And it's not good. When we made this point in previous episodes, we'll make it again, and I'm sure we'll make it in future episodes as well. God never asks a question as an inquiry. It's always a question meant to cause the one to whom he speaks and us today who are reading it to reflect upon the true answer of that question. So you have anything else before we move on to verse 7?
Well, just quickly, I'm first and last, as you already touched about the eternality of God. Everything about God is affected by that. If at any moment God changes in knowledge or anything that he does, it affects his immutability. It affects everything about his being, but it affects his eternality. And
Mhm.
so when we call God into question, we're ultimately calling, all of it into question. Because if we're saying that God has changed or is different than he used to be, in a sense that, he thinks something new or has gained new knowledge, then that, we've really destroyed everything we know about God. So when he's saying I am the first and the last, yeah, he's saying I stand outside of time.
Right.
And that's why he is the only God. There is no God besides him, because there couldn't be.
Excellent point. And that's gonna play a part here in just a moment. Verse 7, who is like me? Let him proclaim it. Let him declare and set it before me, since I appointed an ancient people. Let them declare what is to come and what will happen. What do you have there?
Well, I have a reference back to chapter 41 and verse 22, when he calls them to tell future events at that point, and that's kind of what I'm seeing here. He's just making a comparison. You want to put your trust in these people? Okay, what can they do compared to what I can do? Absolutely nothing. And he's already proven on more than one occasion that they don't have the ability to do what he can do.
Absolutely. This reminds me. In fact, I underlined that question: who was like me? And I put Job 38 through 41. Those 4 chapters, I guess. After Satan takes everything from Job, after Satan inflicts everything was short of taking his life from him, and then Job's friends come to comfort him, and they have this conversation about God. Chapter 38, God approaches in a whirlwind, and you see throughout, as Job, give me an opportunity to defend myself, give me an opportunity to plead my case to the Lord, and I'll be found right. I'll be found I'll be able to prove that I've been treated unfair. And God approaches them in that, and it's not a explanation of what happened. He doesn't tell Job, no, it wasn't me, it was Satan. He doesn't tell the friends what they said right or what they said wrong. Uh, Job 38 through 41 is simply God asking questions. Where were you when this took place? Where were you when this took place? Where were you when this took place? And again, exemplifying the sovereignty. This statement, this question, who is like me, stems from the I am the first and last statement in the previous
Yeah.
verse. I am eternal. I operate outside of creation because I am the creator. I am sovereign. I answer to nobody. And you go to Hebrews chapter 5, verse 7, when it talks about Jesus learned he obedience, or Philippians chapter 2 and verse 8, became obedient. And some will look at it from the standpoint of he was unwilling to obey, and then finally he submitted himself to obedience. That's not what it means. It means that Jesus had to step out of a role as the sovereign God, the one who obeyed nobody because there was no one for him to obey, and stepped into a role where he had to obey for the first time because he had never done it. We talked about it last season when we looked at Hebrews chapter 5. And that's the point here. Who's like me? Nobody. What else you have?
Well, I mean, I think we're right along the same line there. But God, this is all just proof of who he really is and the fact that he is the only God, because no one else could do what he can do. No one else can predict future events. No one can declare the order of how things are going to happen. Only the ultimate God, that who is the first and the last, can do those things. So again, when we're talking about hope, and hey, you're going to get to come back after 70 years, you're going to be redeemed, these types of things, we need to put, and even today, who we're going to put our trust in. We're going to put our trust in the fallible man, which we know will ultimately die and fall away, or we're going to trust in the one true and living God who's been faithful throughout all the ages as far back as we can read.
No, great point, and that's the idea. Since I appointed an ancient people, you go to James 4. Our life is but a vapor, and the audience to whom he's speaking falls inside that category. And I think it's interesting here. God is pointing out that there is a lot of history that took place before you came to this earth, and knowing what we know now from a lot of the revelation and God's plan of redemption, that there's a lot that has to take place after you've left this earth. It's kind of like when I was leaving a company, or I wasn't leaving, but one of my managers retired. He got up and just said, I kind of look at me leaving this company as sticking my hand in a pail of water. When you pull it out, what impression is left is essentially the impression you've left on this company. And the point he was making is that the company existed long before he started working there, and the company would continue on long after he was gone. And that's similar to what this statement is I will still be in control even after you've come and gone. And like you made, why trust an infallible man? Why not trust in the one who has existed through it all? Because when all's said and done, we're all in the same boat. We're here for a short amount of time, and then we're no longer here. What else you have?
Well, we had an instructor at Brown Trail that used to talk about all of time and all of history, and he would say if you walk up to a wall and you put your nose against the wall, your peripheral vision's only like this. Well,
Mm-hmm.
that's basically our time on this earth. Now back up to the other side of the room where you can see the whole wall. That's what God's seeing. He's seeing from the beginning to the end as the first and the last. We're only seeing just a small amount of time. And so that's the benefit of having writings that, the Lord recording things so that we can look all the way back to the beginning and see his faithfulness and his fair judgments and so on and so forth.
Excellent point. Reminds me of 1 Peter chapter 1, 10 through 12. Like you mentioned, the prophets who wrote, essentially we're looking at it from the wall perspective. You and I, with the full revelation, now see the big picture. Was it Ephesians 3 and verse 10 that his wisdom might be known to the principalities and powers by the church? I think sometimes we may undervalue the fact that we have Genesis through Revelation in its entirety. We stand on this side of the redemptive plan. From a faith perspective, it's I don't want to say it takes more faith to live in the time that they did, but they had a lot more questions as far as how God operated concerning how man was going to be redeemed and restored, reconciled to God. You and I are very blessed to be on this part or this side of the redemptive plan. and having it in its entirety to understand. Now it's just for us to use the examples of nations like Israel and so forth to essentially live our lives in accordance to God's will. You have anything else?
Nope, that's it for that one.
Verse 8, fear not, nor be afraid. Have I not told you of old and declared it, and you are my witnesses. Is there a God besides me? There is no rock. I know not any. What do you have there?
Well, a couple things. I mean, do not fear, right? Now we're thinking all the way back to Joshua. You think about Joshua being, here he's taking over a people that had really caused a lot of problems. And he's trying to carry them into a new land. Their leader of 40 years is gone, and suddenly he's going to have to face it all. And God says, don't be afraid. I'm with you. I'm always going to be with you. But what I found interesting is the word there for afraid. This is the only occurrence of it that I found anyway in the Hebrew text. So now the Septuagint uses a different word to translate this word, and they use a word that really describes deception. Don't be deceived. I don't know if that's really where he was going. I found that interesting that they chose that word. But even at that, if that was what they had intended, well, don't be deceived about all the other people that are trying to tell you bad things. We're still trusting in the one true God. And with being afraid, you don't need to be afraid. Why? Because that God is here. He's the one that's going to redeem you. He is your king. He's the one that cares for you, that brought you into existence. Put your hope and trust in him.
Oh, good. Excellent point. You bring that up, that word afraid. I don't think deceive is the way it's going. I think it's a legitimate fear, phobia type fear. And the only reason I say that is because the fear not in verse 8 is also used again in verse 11 when it talks about those who worship idols. It says they shall be terrified, they shall be put to shame together. And that word terrified is a dread or a terror, not the fear that we often associate with God from a reverential respect for who he is and what he is capable of doing. This is a legitimate, I would say this falls into what the Hebrew writer said. It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the Lord. It's a fearful thing to be on the negative side of his judgment. And that's the point he's here. So he's saying, don't be afraid in that terror sense, because one, I've made this promise, and up until now, I've always kept my promise. And you see it. You look throughout the blessings and curses at the end of Deuteronomy. When Israel was loyal to God, they prospered, and when they were not, they did not. And we also want to point out that to get to the point where God has finally told them, captivity's coming, you're being punished, there's a lot of patience and long suffering that goes before that, a lot of warning that goes before that. So it's you look at these questions, the audience, the intention, there are three questions, and I numbered them: who is like me, haven't I told you, and is there a God besides me? Just to point out that the answer is a resounding no, and the whole purpose of this set of questions is to remind the audience essentially to ask themselves how you got to this position. Repentance is the goal of all these questions, of all this punishment. And so, what else do you have?
Well, one thing when we think about the New Testament, sometimes I hear people say, the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. Well, that's the same God. Romans chapter 2 and verse 4 points that out. His long suffering and forbearance now for us and his goodness toward us is to what? Lead us to repentance. And that's the exact same reason he was patient with them, as you just made mention of. All of that, hoping that they would turn back to him. And these things are recorded for our benefit, right? To help us see, look at the mistakes that they made. A lot of times we look at the nation of Israel. Sometimes I think we have a tendency to think about the world, but no, we need, this is the physical representation of the church. We need to be looking at them from the sense of we don't want to do what they did. And that's what Paul brought up to the Corinthians. Use them as an example. Look at their mistakes and their failures and then you look at God and see his faithfulness, which he's bringing up here again, that's why you don't need to be afraid. Because
Right.
you're on the right side of his and you are trusting him, you don't have a reason to be afraid. You know
No,
that he's going to deliver on his promises.
great point. And that reminds me, you look at the word rock there at the end. I circled it.
Mm-hmm.
It capitalized. We're talking about Jesus. We're talking about God himself. And I put no stronghold or fortress to seek refuge. In other words, God's making the point here that he is the refuge. He is the one that provides genuine protection. Is it Matthew chapter 10? When Jesus says, "Fear not those that can do harm to the body, but fear the one who can destroy both the body and the soul." And I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but that's kind of the point of using that word rock here. You can't escape the judgment, and there's no one that can protect you like I can. I've also underlined that phrase, "I know not of any." I like it because it's ironic. Uh, Here is the omniscient God, the God who is all knowing, saying he doesn't know of anyone like him. And so uh, that should resonate uh, loudly with us from the standpoint of if the all-knowing God doesn't have a clue of anyone who is like him, then that means there's no one like him. Which is hopefully what we've tried to communicate this entire time. Is that's what God is saying? Deliverance is ensured. I like the way one commentator put it. Anytime God makes a promise, he made the point that it's a reality. It's something that has happened. It just hasn't been realized. And that's the thought of God making a promise. It's as good as done. Prophetic, what do they call it? Prophetic. Perfect in the sense that God speaks of a future event in the past tense because it is that guaranteed to happen. What else do you have?
Well, when we think the first, at the end, I always kind of see that as though he's being a little bit facetious, right? I don't know anybody. Who are you going to know if I don't, But
Right.
when I think about the rock, okay, again, let's make application for today. If I put all of my hope in Washington, I'm going to be hurt. If I
Right.
put all my hope in even those closest to me, I often say men are men even at their best, right? And even though they may not have bad intentions, sometimes they let us down.
Mm-hmm.
But if I put my hope and trust in God as my rock, that rock's not going to move. It's going to stand firm. And that's where you find confidence.
Excellent. That's a great point. That's an excellent way to close this out. Keden, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it.
Enjoyed it.
To those who are watching, thank you so much for your support. Like, share, subscribe, and check us out for more episodes to come. And with that, we are out.
Thank you.